Hi, Chris Abel from What She Said, here with the extended edition of our ebook cafe series. Our guests this week are Mark and Robyn Leframboise. Mark is a programmer and co-founder of Lightning Rod Games, where they're working on their next title, A Fold Apart, inspired by his own long-distance relationship with Robyn. In this game there are two characters, but instead of one character rescuing the other, or battling the other, or simply following the other around, it's your task to take these two characters who are separated on either side of a world to bring them together at long last.
So Robyn and my relationship was kind of founded as a long-distance relationship from the start. When we first met, I was in school at the University of Waterloo, and Robyn was at McMaster. And so for a little while, for I think it was about 2 years, the beginning of our relationship, we basically only see each other on weekends. We'd take the bus back and forth. And so that was kind of how we started off. And then after I graduated, I ended up doing a year of school in Vancouver. So I ended up moving all the way to the West Coast for a little bit. And then Robyn was going into teacher's college then in Windsor. And then she eventually moved out to Vancouver. And so we were together there for a year. And then I got laid off from my job there, and she was having a hard time finding work there. So she ended up moving back to Ontario. And then I got a job in California. And I was there for probably about another year and a half. That was probably the hardest part, was that year and a half there, because we got married in the middle of that. And so I got to see her for our...
Flew back for the wedding.
Our wedding. I came back for the wedding, and then we went to the honeymoon, and then basically flew back almost immediately.
Separate ways.
Yeah, back to California. So that was pretty tough. And then my co-founder Steven and I started Lightning Rod Games after we came back to Ontario. And then almost immediately after, we found out that we were accepted into the incubator execution labs in Montreal. So we ended up moving again for another 6 months. And then we finally were able to come back in August of 2013. So Rob and I started dating June 2007. And August 2013 was really the first time where we could actually start living together after we got married.
Wow. Okay. That's crazy.
So that's kind of our background.
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of emotional ups and downs that being in a long distance relationship entails. And it's just, it's something where it's like you have to try really, really hard. You have to have a lot of trust in each other. And there's times where it's really hard, and the highs are really high too. Like when you actually get to see each other during those times, it's awesome. But then the worst time in a long distance relationship I found was always immediately after you saw them and they left again, and you knew you were going back into the long distance relationship. After it's been a couple months, you kind of almost numb to it, but seeing them again really kind of reopened the wounds a little bit. It makes it tough. And that's the type of stuff, there's a lot of that emotion that I think isn't touched on in a lot of media in general, but especially in games. And so that was something I wanted to put into A Fold Apart.
Wow. So, Robyn, what was it about that relationship that made it something that you could survive? Because it's amazing. That's 7 years of having to maintain a relationship, long distance, and getting married. So that's a big decision to say, okay, this is sort of the state of our relationship. It's been long distance. Let's still take this big step. That must have been a very optimistic step.
Yeah, family and friends called us crazy for a long time because I can't tell you how many times I could count on my fingers that we were told I could never do that, and that would be awful, and you guys are crazy for doing that. But I don't know what that one thing is, because there's so many little things that just kept me going that I'm like, well, I have to be with this guy. This is the best guy in the whole wide world. And when somebody loves you just the way you are, flaws and all, it's very hard to find. And so you fight to make sure you keep that. We got really good at communication. We used to call each other all the time and talk to each other, and lots of thank you FaceTime for that. It was hard, but you go into this weird mode where, like Mark said, you could become numb to it, or you just survive and you're just counting down the days till the next time and the next time. But I think the most important thing is for any long distance relationship, in my experience, is that you have to have eventually, whether it's a year, 5 years, 10 years, you have to have an end date of being together maybe at some point. Although I know there are people out there that just have been long distance for years and years, and that works for them. But we knew that eventually we wanted to be in the same spot together.
And so there is a happy ending here, because the two of you have been in the same spot for a couple of years now, right?
Yes, going on 3 years, so that's nice.
Okay, so how do you take that experience and start to have that conversation of, hey, this would make a video game.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting because it kind of started with just the story, and I knew I wanted to convey those emotions of the long distance relationship and tell a story. But we also didn't want to just make a game that had a story about a long distance relationship. We wanted the actual gameplay to kind of facilitate that. And that wasn't something that was immediate. Like, we had started the company, and I had kind of been floating this idea. I'm like, I really want to make a game about a long distance relationship, but I don't know how. It was after, I think it was GDC one year, when Steven and I were just kind of brainstorming game mechanic ideas. Like, what are things that people hadn't seen before in games? And he brought up the idea of kind of like the back of a Mad magazine, where you have one picture and then you fold it and it creates a new picture.
Oh, yeah.
And at the time we were like, that's neat. No one's really done anything with folding or anything like that, but it's like not immediately obvious what the gameplay would be. And then it was a couple months later where I was kind of just thinking of ideas for game stuff, and it kind of struck me. I was like, folding paper is actually a really good metaphor for a long distance relationship, because if you have these two characters and they live on opposite sides of a piece of paper, they're basically in different worlds, and they can't get to one another. But then if you fold that paper, all of a sudden you can like merge those two worlds together and create like a way for them to reunite. And I thought that was really cool because it basically reflects what your feelings are in a long distance relationship, where you're just like, you're usually in a long distance relationship because of some external reason, like either a career or a family or things like that. And so it's like, you don't really necessarily want to be apart, and you just wish you could like take where you are and where they are and like physically mash them together. And that's kind of what folding the paper and merging the two worlds is in the game. So it kind of acts as a really cool metaphor for a long distance relationship.
Yeah, it's very beautiful in the sense that it's an attempt to try to take that long distance and find a way to make it shorter, or at least seem to be shorter, to bring two people who are far away together without them necessarily being in a different spot or being in a different space. So, I find that very expressive. Have you spent a lot of time playing with things like papercraft, origami in real life, or has it just been mainly digital?
No, every single one of our levels is prototyped on paper first. It's really quick. It's actually really nice. I have like this stack of graph paper that I've cut up into like little level size chunks. Yeah. So I try to keep them tidy, but we have all these, like, whenever we come up with ideas for a mechanic or like a puzzle, I'm like, I can just kind of sketch it out on the paper, and I can actually manipulate the paper to see how that works. And then we've kind of created the tools now in the game and Unity, our engine, to be able to create, like, kind of translate that grid paper to the digital. So it's always like paper first and then digital after. In
terms of if somebody's sitting down playing your game, you've got two characters. Are you seeing those characters all the time? Is it one on one side of the screen, the other on another side of the screen, or?
So we're kind of telling the story. We're still working out the details on how the story plays out, but we know that you're going to play as both characters, and they're apart. So they're kind of separated for a large part of the game, and it's more about the way that they communicate with one another while they're apart. It kind of reflects the way that you communicate when you're in a long-distance relationship. You don't really get to interact with them a lot, but when you do, it's awesome. And so we kind of want to convey that as well with the gameplay. So they're not always on the opposite sides of each other. Like, sometimes you just use the paper to kind of traverse through the level. And so what happens is you'll play through as both characters. So in our game, there's an architect who's kind of moved away from the teacher, which is pretty similar to us. I'm a game designer, and she is actually a teacher. So we use that as the character references.
Oh, that's sweet.
And so you kind of play as both. And then one thing we are doing is important to everyone on our team, and it's important to Robyn as well. We want to make sure that players can play as whatever gender combinations they want. So our characters are an architect and a teacher, but you can mix it up, boy, girl, either or.
It's, LGBT friendly. Like, you could be 2 boys, 2 girls, so.
If I caught that right, one of the characters is a teacher. Robyn, are you now a video game character? How do you feel about that?
I think that's fantastic. As someone who's loved video games forever and loves action figures and anything cute, I think that's the ultimate honor to be made into a video character. And I think the character designs are fantastic. And they have our height difference in there, so I think that's cool. I mean, Mark is not as short as this character, but I think it's great that the woman is actually taller. And because I'm 6 feet in real life, so...
And is there any elements of a story? I mean, are there screens where people get to read or hear what's happening between these two characters?
No, we're trying to keep it, for cost purposes and also accessibility purposes, we're trying to keep it so there's not a lot of localization that we need to do. So we're trying to do it as kind of visually as possible. So it's a lot of it is the character animation is a big focus for how we're going to do the storytelling. As we're trying to minimize the amount of text on the screen, and we don't really want to do voice acting, especially in different languages. That's kind of like one of our big challenges right now. We have a dedicated animator right now, Robyn, who's doing a really good job with all that stuff right now. He's really bringing the characters to life and kind of giving them that personality, which I think is going to be very important to tell the story very well.
So give me an idea of what the barrier would be between the two characters. What are we seeing when you describe it as being paper? Is it a case of like a puzzle that pops up, or is it their actual world is made of paper?
Yeah, so these are characters who basically live inside paper that is on top of a desktop. And so they're in almost like two separate areas of this desk. And so you can travel paper to paper. So it's a side scroller. So it's very similar to, we call it a puzzle platformer. There's no really platforming. There's no jumping. But the idea of walking from one side, like from the left to the right, is kind of still intact in our game. So you start in one paper and you walk right, and then you'll have a adjacent paper that you can just walk into. You kind of cross over. And eventually you'll get to areas where you can't cross over, and there'll be a gap. And that paper in the middle can be manipulated, so you can like flip it over, fold it, unfold it, kind of move the character around to kind of manipulate them through this puzzle to get to the other side. And that's how they kind of cross from one side to the other.
The sequences I've seen, it kind of reminds me of the movie Inception. The idea of playing with
cool.
the world around you, folding the cityscape, and sort of, and again, you know, with one character being an architect, that idea of taking the world around you and being able to perceive it in a different way, and therefore find solutions that normally you wouldn't have in reality.
Yes, absolutely. So because you're able to fold, and especially when you start doing some folds such as diagonal fold, which will end up rotating whatever is in that part of the fold, you can start really playing with some of the physical environments of the papers. So you can fold, if you have a character standing on a platform and then you fold down from the top, you can actually drop him into the backside of the paper. One of the things that we're working on as well is playing with some like environmental effects inside the paper, such as like rain or wind, which would have effects based on how you fold them in from one side to the other as well.
Oh, cool. Okay. I understand the intention is to put it out for PC?
It's going to be on PC, and we're also aiming to release it on PS4, Xbox One, and potentially Nintendo Switch. Well, we're not entirely sure all the details on that one yet because it's fairly new.
Gotcha. I was just wondering if there are certain platforms that tend to be more attractive as an indie developer than others. I mean, is there certain systems that's where you have your best chances to go for?
All of them. That's how you get your best chances, is you release on as many platforms as you possibly can. And I think that's the best way to release games as an indie is market saturation. Like, get it in front of anyone who wants to play it, I think is the best way to do it. I mean, generally speaking, like PC, console, you want to make a game that ideally works on all of them equally well. And that's one thing that we are working on right now, is making sure our controller feels just as good as a mouse and keyboard. So that way, you know, no matter how a person chooses to play our game, they're going to be able to have like the best experience possible.
And that brings us to the competition that you now have entered into, the Ubisoft Indie Series. I think it's fantastic that, yes, you have to have a grand prize, but I think would seem to me to be very attractive because they're also offering things like mentoring, marketing, and financial support. I mean, is that more valuable to an indie developer to have those kinds of resources in a competition rather than just a big monetary prize?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Money's always a necessity just to make the game, but beyond that, like having the mentorship, especially from a studio the size of Ubisoft, is always going to be really important. They have some insights, especially on the console side, which generally speaking is a bit of a black box to indies. It's really hard to kind of get good estimates for how games sell on consoles. And so that's one area that a larger publisher like Ubisoft could really shed some light on for us as well.
Robyn, you said you love playing video games. Can you tell me a little bit about the kind of games that you're into?
I'm definitely grew up with Spyro the Dragon and Crash Bandicoot, and even the survival horror like Resident Evil 2 is my first introduction to that. But funny enough, our first week of dating, Mark gave me a free trial to World of Warcraft, and we're going on 10 years this year, so I've been playing that ever since.
Wow! So
yeah.
You're still playing World of Warcraft?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Legion's great.
Legion's great. Yeah, what kind of character do you play?
Oh, definitely the new Demon Hunter. But I'm usually a warlock. That's my favorite.
Okay. Now, I had asked you both if you would be so kind as to share or recommend a book. I'm wondering if you do have one that you can share.
Yes. Do you want to go first, Mark, or do you want me to?
You go first.
Okay, I'm going to say the Startup Life One, Surviving and Thriving in a Relationship with an Entrepreneur is a really good one. Mark gave it to me when we first started out, and it's been fantastic. I still have it on my shelf because it's about this couple that they're both, I think, entrepreneurs, if I remember, and just the ups and downs and the highs and lows, because when you're married to an entrepreneur, it's very different from somebody who goes to work essentially from 9 to 5 and has regular paychecks and, things like that. Whereas entrepreneurs, they have money and they don't have money. They have good times for planning and bad, and you really have to be flexible and adaptable, patient, and you have to love the heck out of them. So, and then I'll let you recommend the other one.
Yeah, so the other one is called For Better or For Work. It's by Meg Cadeau-Hirschberg. It's kind of a similar book, although it's specifically about the wife of an entrepreneur, which I found particularly insightful, because sometimes when you're an entrepreneur and you're like head down in the work, you see all the problems, but sometimes like your partner doesn't always see those problems. They're working normal job, and then they come home and you're just kind of seeing the results of your day, good or bad. And so they have to ride that kind of wave with you sometimes, and it's really helpful to realize you have to kind of compartmentalize the work life from your home life and keep things kind of separated. You just got to make sure that you're not bringing your stress from one over to the other, and you can enjoy each other's company.
All right.
And I forgot to say that mine was by Brad Feld and Amy Batchelor.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much. I really am looking forward to playing a folded part, and I wish you and Lightning Rod Games best of luck at next week's competition.
All right, thanks very much, Chris.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's been fun.